Bread. Today, it is a staple that we buy from the store and toast for breakfast or slice for sandwiches. But in the Middle Ages, bread was more than a food. It was survival, culture, religion, and power rolled into one loaf. In this video, we'll transport you to medieval villages, monasteries, and marketplaces where you can see how bread was really made. From the ancient grain sowing to the town busying community ovens, you will be surprised at how this one-time, humble staple of daily life shaped people's days. So stick with us until the end of this video, where you will learn the ancient magic that was baking bread in the Middle Ages. And be sure to share your kindest wishes or thoughts in the comments. We're always glad to hear from you. Before we have a look at how medieval bread was made in reality, we must come to grips with why it is so important to people all across the medieval globe. Bread was more than sustenance. It was a symbol, a tool of control, a sacred offering. And, sometimes, between life and death, it's hard to imagine what it would be like to exist in a world where most people are peasants, agricultural workers, whose lives revolved around a single irreducible concern: having enough to eat. For these folks, bread wasn't simply a part of dinner. In many cases, bread was dinner. Bread constituted the majority of the average medieval European diet, accounting for 50 to 80% of an individual's caloric intake in most societies. Meat was seldom eaten by the lower classes. Vegetables were seasonal. Cheese and dairy were limited. But bread, corner shop bread, was de rigueur daily, in abundance and filling. The importance of bread was so profound that even when people said food, often they meant bread to the exclusion of all else. In many places, the word for to eat was the same as to eat bread. But bread was not just an everyday staple, it exposed your social status. Not all bread was the same. The poor frequently consumed a coarse, dark bread composed of rye, barley, or oats. These were compact and gritty, and could easily be filled with chaff or even dirt. The wealthy, however, feasted on a fine white bread made of heavily sifted wheat flour, what was known in England as manchat, or in France as pain blanc. The whiter the bread, the higher the rank of the eater. This was not simply a matter of taste, it was an issue of optics. White bread signified refinement, prosperity, and purity. It needed work and more costly milling, affordable only to the rich. But the irony: poor people's black breads were usually healthier than the refined loaves of the rich. Outside class, bread had religious import in its own right. Christianity, the religion that ruled Europe in medieval times, planted bread at the center of its most solemn ceremony, the Eucharist. At Mass, the bread was thought to transform into the body of Christ. It was these religious connotations that lent gravity to the process of bread making. Baking in monasteries and convents was a holy thing. Bread was blessed and given to the poor as alms in cathedrals. Bread was frequently used to bind religious pacts or exchanged in ceremonies to commemorate significant points in life: birth, marriage, death. For more, bread was not only sustenance, it was spiritual nourishment, a gift from God. Rulers understood that if the people did not have bread, the next stop was potential rebellion, so they kept a tight fist on its production and price. Bread's political weight has roots other than its caloric density. Its place in the daily life of citizens, or the chilling mention of its name in A Tale of Two Cities, when anyone who dared to steal bread was hacked piecemeal and left hanging on a post with enough of a chain and padlock to have let him out. Throughout history, bread has had even more specific symbolic meanings in the culture and politics of societies. The world over, in feudal societies, lords owned the local oven and peasants had to bake their bread there, paying a fee or giving a portion of their dough as rent. That gave the lord actual control over what emerged from the oven. In the cities, a network of municipal authorities controlled bakers, implemented price controls on bread to avoid inflation and famine riots. At the same time, medieval chroniclers frequently mentioned uprisings that started with a scarcity or hoarding of bread. Even the Magna Carta of 1215, England's Great Charter of Liberty, had a section on making bread the same weight. That's how important it was. But behind each loaf was a whole agricultural cycle that spanned seasons. Medieval bread didn't just materialize at the oven. It started with fieldwork, with plowing, sowing, reaping, threshing, and grinding. Every action was tedious and fraught with the risk of loss. A drought or flood wasn't just a bad year, it meant less bread, and less bread led to hunger or to starvation. The so-called Great Famine, of 1315 to 1317 in Europe was more than a food shortage. It was a bread shortage. Crops failed, grain stores emptied, and millions went hungry or died. In this way, bread was not only about food, it was a lifeline. Baking bread itself was an often communal act. In most villages there were no private ovens. Wood was precious, and baking was a laborious task that required time and experience. So people built communal ovens, which were typically owned by the lord or the church. Peasants made their own dough at home and hauled it to the baker to bake, often with personal stamps or carvings to distinguish one loaf from another. These ovens were social centers, nodes for gossip, news sharing, celebration, and even protest. Bread smelled not only hungering, it smelled life. Bread is referred to in all writings of that period, so 14. Medieval cookbooks, laws, chronicles, religious texts, even works of literature and songs, all talk about bread in some context. This is from a 13th century English text. Better a dry morsel and quiet therewith, than an house full of sacrifices with strife. That is to say, bread, even plain bread, was better than any feast, when accompanied with peace. Folk tales and songs told of the woman who ran out of flour, or the man who stole a loaf to feed his family. Theft of bread was endemic in times of scarcity, and it could be treated as a crime, but also as a cry. In some cultures, presents at a festival required special breads, loaves decorated with herbs, stamped with symbols, or formed into crosses and animals. These weren't just food, they were sacrifices, talismans and rejoinders. So even before we've gotten our hands on the dough or fired up the oven, we can see that medieval bread carried huge cultural, religious, and political significance. It was a daily necessity for survival, a status symbol of the wealthy and elite, a religious symbol used in Christian liturgy. Power was the tool for kings, nobility, and the church. An act of community, identity, and tradition. In other words, to know what bread was like in the Middle Ages, we need to know what it was like to live in bread. Having journeyed to the core of the loaf, let's now follow the path of grain from seed to crust. Bread. Today, it is a staple that we buy from the store and toast for breakfast or slice for sandwiches. But in the Middle Ages, bread was more than a food. It was survival, culture, religion, and power rolled into one loaf. In this video, we'll transport you to medieval villages, monasteries, and marketplaces where you can see how bread was really made. From the ancient grain sowing to the town busying community ovens, you will be surprised at how this one-time humble staple of daily life shaped people's days. So stick with us until the end of this video, where you will learn the ancient magic that was baking bread in the Middle Ages. And be sure to share your kindest wishes or thoughts in the comments. We're always glad to hear from you. Before we have a look at how medieval bread was made in reality, we must come to grips with why it is so important to people all across the medieval globe. Bread was more than sustenance. It was a symbol, a tool of control, a sacred offering. And, sometimes, between life and death, it's hard to imagine what it would be like to exist in a world where most people are peasants, agricultural workers, whose lives revolved around a single irreducible concern: having enough to eat. For these folks, bread wasn't simply a part of dinner. In many cases, bread was dinner. Bread constituted the majority of the average medieval European diet, accounting for 50 to 80% of an individual's caloric intake in most societies. Meat was seldom eaten by the lower classes. Vegetables were seasonal. Cheese and dairy were limited. But bread, corner shop bread, was de rigueur daily, in abundance and filling. The importance of bread was so profound that even when people said food, often they meant bread to the exclusion of all else. In many places, the word for to eat was the same as to eat bread. But bread was not just an everyday staple, it exposed your social status. Not all bread was the same. The poor frequently consumed a coarse, dark bread composed of rye, barley, or oats. These were compact and gritty, and could easily be filled with chaff or even dirt. The wealthy, however, feasted on a fine white bread made of heavily sifted wheat flour, what was known in England as manchat, or in France as pain blanc. The whiter the bread, the higher the rank of the eater. This was not simply a matter of taste, it was an issue of optics. White bread signified refinement, prosperity, and purity. It needed work and more costly milling, affordable only to the rich. But the irony: Poor people's black breads were usually healthier than the refined loaves of the rich. Outside class, bread had religious import in its own right. Christianity, the religion that ruled Europe in medieval times, planted bread at the center of its most solemn ceremony, the Eucharist. At Mass, the bread was thought to transform into the body of Christ. It was these religious connotations that lent gravity to the process of bread making. Baking in monasteries and convents was a holy thing. Bread was blessed and given to the poor as alms in cathedrals. Bread was frequently used to bind religious pacts or exchanged in ceremonies to commemorate significant points in life: birth, marriage, death. For more, bread was not only sustenance, it was spiritual nourishment, a gift from God. Rulers understood that if the people did not have bread, the next stop was potential rebellion, so they kept a tight fist on its production and price. Bread's political weight has roots other than its caloric density, its place in the daily life of citizens, or the chilling mention of its name in A Tale of Two Cities, when anyone who dared to steal bread was hacked piecemeal and left hanging on a post with enough of a chain and padlock to have let him out. Throughout history, bread has had even more specific symbolic meanings in the culture and politics of societies. The world over, in feudal societies, lords owned the local oven and peasants had to bake their bread there, paying a fee or giving a portion of their dough as rent. That gave the lord actual control over what emerged from the oven. In the cities, a network of municipal authorities controlled bakers, implemented price controls on bread to avoid inflation and famine riots. At the same time, medieval chroniclers frequently mentioned uprisings that started with a scarcity or hoarding of bread. Even the Magna Carta of 1215, England's Great Charter of Liberty, had a section on making bread the same weight. That's how important it was. But behind each loaf was a whole agricultural cycle that spanned seasons. Medieval bread didn't just materialize at the oven. It started with fieldwork, with plowing, sowing, reaping, threshing and grinding. Every action was tedious and fraught with the risk of loss. A drought or flood wasn't just a bad year, it meant less bread, and less bread led to hunger or to starvation. The so-called Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 in Europe was more than a food shortage. It was a bread shortage. Crops failed, grain stores emptied, and millions went hungry or died. In this way, bread was not only about food, it was a lifeline. Baking bread itself was an often communal act. In most villages there were no private ovens. Wood was precious, and baking was a laborious task that required time and experience. So people built communal ovens, which were typically owned by the lord or the church. Peasants made their own dough at home and hauled it to the baker to bake, often with personal stamps or carvings to distinguish one loaf from another. These ovens were social centers, nodes for gossip, news sharing, celebration, and even protest. Bread smelled not only hungering, it smelled life. Bread is referred to in all writings of that period. So, 14. Medieval cookbooks, laws, chronicles, religious texts, even works of literature and songs, all talk about bread in some context. This is from a 13th century English text. Better a dry morsel and quiet therewith than an house full of sacrifices with strife. That is to say, bread, even plain bread, was better than any feast when accompanied with peace. Folk tales and songs told of the woman who ran out of flour, or the man who stole a loaf to feed his family. Theft of bread was endemic in times of scarcity, and it could be treated as a crime, but also as a cry. In some cultures, presents at a festival required special breads, loaves decorated with herbs, stamped with symbols, or formed into crosses and animals. These weren't just food, they were sacrifices, talismans and rejoinders. So even before we've gotten our hands on the dough or fired up the oven, we can see that medieval bread carried huge cultural, religious, and political significance. It was a daily necessity for survival, a status symbol of the wealthy and elite, a religious symbol used in Christian liturgy. Power was the tool for kings, nobility, and the church. An act of community, identity, and tradition. In other words, to know what bread was like in the Middle Ages, we need to know what it was like to live in bread. Having journeyed to the core of the loaf, let's now follow the path of grain from seed to crust. The feudal economy of grain. For the most part, grain was not sold openly. Lords, monasteries, or towns had monopoly control. Peasants owed their local lords some portion of their crop, as much as 30 to 50%. This was paid as a tithe to the church, feudal due to the manor, or a rent to landowners. A little bit of the grain had been ground and set aside for bread. The rest can either be traded, saved as seed, or given away as presents. Grain merchants and millers in urban areas brought the early market to life, and in time developed an entire economy around the price of grain. When crops were bad, the cost of food soared, bread became scarce. Riots often followed. In a lot of ways, grain was money, the actual gold standard of the peasants. Grain in the law, the religion, and the daily life. Medieval laws frequently revolved around preserving grain. Somebody could get in big trouble for stealing from a field. To intentionally damage grain was punishable by exile or mutilation. People were willing to risk these penalties, though, in desperate times, to feed their children. Religious rituals were also related to the seasons of grain. They'd have a blessing of the fields in the spring, feast of either Saint Isidore or St. Cuthbert, the patron saints of farmers. Lammas Day Loaf Mass on the 1st of August, when the first loaf of bread from the harvest of wheat was presented to the church. Bread, and by extension, grain, was enfolded in a greater spiritual ecosystem. The act of planting seeds was not only a matter of survival, it was one of faith. So now we know. Bread making in the Middle Ages was grounded in a brutal, sacred relationship to the land. It was a process that bound families and villages to an unforgiving agricultural calendar, took immense amounts of labor from whole communities. Was the product of innovations such as the heavy plow and three-field system, survival cut with ritual, drudgery with celebration. A season of mud, sweat, prayer and danger stood behind every medieval loaf. Chapter 3 invites us into the next phase of the bread odyssey, the medieval mill, in which grain turned into flour. Here, amid millstones and waterways, a new sort of power was growing. The fields have been reaped, the harvest stored. Now comes one of the most important, and often underappreciated, stages of medieval bread making, grinding grain into flour. That step was more than a mere mechanical process in the Middle Ages. It was its offering, converting raw, dried grain into the fine workable flour that ultimately would be bread. And it was a process fraught with politics, labor, economics, and suspicion, because the mill was not only a technological wonder, but also a hotbed of strife in the medieval village. In this chapter, we'll enter the medieval millwater, wind, or muscle-driven ant, join the miller's gritty world of toppled wagon walls, wooden shoes and creak, bowing slippery. From grain to flour, the necessity incident. To know bread, you must know flour, the fine powder obtained by grinding grain. Medieval people knew this to be a magical transformation. He started with a rock of an indigestible seed and ended with the foundation of all nourishment. But that shift didn't take place in kitchens, and it happened in mills, dedicated structures, where grain was crushed, ground and sifted. The type of flour would define the texture, appearance, and flavor of bread. Improper milling resulted in hulky, gritty flour. Careful grinding produced fine flour suited for a lord's table. But quality milling took power, and power, in the Middle Ages, came in all shapes and sizes. The rise of the watermill, the most radical change in the consecution of flour in medieval times, was the watermill. Powered by the natural force of a flowing river, a waterwheel spun gears and powered millstones, great rounded stones, often weighing hundreds of pounds, that ground grain into flour. Watermills date back to Roman times, yet were more widespread in medieval Europe. They were in use in much of the Roman Empire, as well as in Islamic Spain and North Africa, from the 7th century, and introduced to England by the Anglo-Saxons in the mid-7th century, where they were in use until the late 19th century. Why? Because they saved labor, rather than grinding grain by hand, backbreaking, time-consuming work. A single miller, working the river's flow, could mill vast amounts of grain in a day. It revolutionized bread production. In the 13th century, some had a watermill in every village. By 1300, there were estimated to be 6,000 wrought iron mills in the province of England. The windmill, alternative, in flatter, drier areas where rivers were few and far between, in parts of the Netherlands, in northern France, and in southern England, for example, people relied on the windmill. These mills used wind to turn sails, or vanes that in turn drove the grinding machines. The first historical sources for European windmills are in the 12th century, and there is quite a bit of literature on how quickly the technology spread. In that, Like the watermill, they changed the local economy so that milling was no longer a cottage industry and allowed large-scale production of flour even in areas without a fast-flowing stream. Windmills are so iconic of the medieval landscape, towering wooden or stone structures in flat farm country, creaking in the breeze. Handmills, tools for the poor. Men, not everyone had water or windmills nearby. For peasants without access to a mill, the quernstone was indispensable, a small circular hand mill that ground grain quietly by hand. There were two main types: saddle quern, the oldest form, which consisted of a rough, flat base and a smaller upper stone used to grind the grain. Rotary quern, a two-part quern stone that was a stationary, lower stone and one that turned on top of it. An object called a handstone. It was hard work. Grinding with a quern, a loaf, could require an hour to be ground. Most commonly this work was done by children and women, and yet, for generations, it was what many rural families had to use. They were one of the most ubiquitous presences of daily life, standing in the still valley of medieval Europe, or near the rushing of streams, or upon the crest of windswept hills. The mill. Here harvested grain, wheat, rye, barley was ground into flour with which to bake. Yet milling was not only mechanical, it was locus of power, a center of technology, and, in many respects, a site of control. In this chapter, we delved deep into the medieval world of milling and looked at how flour was produced, who the mill owners were, and how this bread-making basic formed the lives of peasants and kings. The rise of the medieval mill. Image credit. Digestein, Picture Library, Getty Images. Mechanical milling started from the 9th century and spread down the length of the medieval Europe. Prior to this, folks used tools such as mortar and pestle, grinding wheat berries into rough flour. Quern, a handheld stone set, grinding device for small-scale domestic grinding, mostly known for use by women. These were exhausting, time-consuming methods. It could take hours of back-breaking labor to generate enough flour to bake a single-family loaf. But then along came the watermill, and later the windmill. These changed everything. Watermills power from the river in the Middle Ages. The watermill was a technological wonder. By directing the current of a river or stream into sluiceways, millers could drive enormous rotating wheels that were used to turn millstones, huge, circular stones necessarily used to grind grain. The basic mechanism, water wheel, operated by the current of a river, shaft and gears, introduced the rotary motion in the perpendicular direction. Millstones, two hard millstones, one fixed, one rotating, against which grain was grinding as it fed in through a central hole. Hopper and chute, grain was poured into the stones, while below, ground flour emerged. Water wheels came in different varieties. Wheels undershot, turned by waters working under them, simpler, less efficient. Overshot wheels, in which water fell onto the wheel from above, more efficient but with incline requirements. Breastjack wheels, water hitting midway, used when water source was consistent but height was limited. Millers used steps, more or less close together to determine how fine to grind. Too wide, and you had coarse meal. Too close, and you'd scorch the flour with the friction. An actual hazard. Watermills were constructed and maintained by big lords or monasteries, not peasants, and they were costly, not only in engineering, but in setting them and acquiring legal rights to watercourses. Windmills, power from the sky, in places without rivers, such as regions of the Low Countries, Spain or southern England, because of a lack of or low gradient rivers. Windmills were what developed. Windmills, which first appeared in Europe in the 12th century, harnessed wind power to turn overhead sails that caught the wind and activated internal gears that turned millstones yet again. Windmills required location with consistent winds. Tall building would be constructed above nearby trees or buildings, systems to turn the sails to the wind. Some early mills trial-tested ones that could pivot all the way around. They were a bit more complex and more unusual than watermills, but every bit as essential in some settings. Who owned the mills? This is how milling gets political. The kings and other nobility organized mills and distilleries. Instead, mills were owned by feudal lords, monasteries, and abbeys. Urban guilds, or town councils. Peasants were frequently required by lords to grind their grain at the lord's mill and were expected to pay a fee for the privilege. This payment, called banalites in France, or multure in England and Scotland, could be made in some of the grain, usually 1/16 to 1/20, a portion of the flour. Coin, were monetized. The use of a private quern as opposed to the lord's mill was illegal in much of the country. Indeed, some lords even seized and broke hand querns to enforce a monopoly on water mills. The power of the mill was real, and many members of the peasantry resented it. The term the miller's toll came to be shorthand for excessive taxation or corruption. The miller respected, feared, distrusted during the medieval period. The miller was a very important and oftentimes the prankster figure of the village. On the other hand, millers were technicians with experience. They knew about machinery, water current, stone sharpening, grain quality, and flour texture. Their work was essential, but on the other, they were frequently marred with allegations of theft, that the millers retained part of the flour as their fee, and that milling took place out of the public eye, made them easily suspected of skimming. Countless folk tales and songs portray millers as avaricious, dishonest scam artists. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales famously features a miller who steals from his clients and tells ribald tales. In folk legend, millers were occasionally regarded as an agent of the devil, maybe because of their secluded, mysterious power, but they were well off compared to the commoner peasant. A prospering miller might have land of his own, dress well, and live in a stately stone house. Flour quality and types milling produced several grades of flour, most sifted through cloth sieves. Wholemeal brown flour included the bran and germ. Rough but nutritious. White flour, the resultant flour, from multiple smother, more processed and less nutritious. Middlings, a middle product, typically used for animal feed. The poorest had the wholemeal flour. The richer you were, the whiter your bread. But white flour cost more to produce. It took extra sifting, or even double milling. In some places, ash or chalk were illegally added to flour to whiten it or add weight, an early version of food fraud. Milling in monasteries. Religious communities, particularly Benedictine and Cistercian, developed large collections of mills in order to support the monasteries that they dominated. They then had access to wealth, land, engineering, expertise, and labor. Monks utilized water power, not exclusively for milling, but also fulling wool, irrigating fields, operating bellows for metalwork, flushing waste from latrines. One abbey might have more than one mill, for grain, for cloth, all taxed and all profitable. They often developed into regional milling centers, which would service the commercial needs of local villages, and developed economies of scale, which allowed large-scale stimulus of the bread economy. They were to provide bread to the poor in exchange, particularly on feast days or during Lent. Urban mills and guild control. With the rapid expansion of medieval towns, both baking and milling were heavily controlled. Municipal mills and professional millers and bakers were supported by city governments, especially in large cities such as London, Paris, and Florence. Guilds ensured consistency in flour quality, fair pricing, prevention of fraud, proper weights and measures. Flour was regularly inspected. An honest miller could be fined, disgraced, or even expelled from the city. At other times, central mills were directly connected to bakeries, a primitive form of vertical integration, consolidating the process from grain to loaf. Disasters, famine, and the mill. The more dangerous milling became, the more critical it was. A failed harvest meant less grain to mill, higher prices. Angry, desperate peasants some hid grain from lords or avoided their requirement to have it ground. Millers could be accused of hoarding. Whenever an unfair practice was suspected, grain riots were likely to break out in towns in Europe. One example, in 1315-17's Great Famine, French and English records report starving peasants attacking mills and grain stores. Flour was a food and a weapon. Maintaining the mills were not structures standing idly by. They were in need of constant upkeep. Samson's mill prepared for grinding by dressing, chipping the millstones regularly to maintain sharpness and friction. Wooden gears decayed or wore out. Floods or droughts might interfere with the water supply. The sails on windmills ripped or had to move about based on the wind. Millers were, of course, mechanical engineers, masons and carpenters, all in a single person. It was years before apprentices became full millers. Milling is part of daily life. Visiting the mill to grind grain was part of the working day for most peasants. They would load sacks into trucks or on mules, and oxen sometimes travel several miles to the local mill stand in line, waiting, talking, fighting, and swapping newspaper, the toll, and get their flour, often labeled with distinctive marks to avoid Mix-up sit was a ritual of society embedded into the warp and weft of village life. Conclusion of Chapter 3. Behind every medieval loaf. After all, there was not only a field, but a mill, a place of engineering, social hierarchy, and subtle conflict. To summarize, mills turned agriculture into food that could actually be eaten. Over the distance between field and oven, the second piece was a quiet revolution in how we produce food, all relentlessly water and wind-driven. Milling was an element of control, a source of revenue, and a cause of political friction, especially for the peasants. Miller existed at the confluence of necessity and scorn. Admire for their art, but scorned for their fees. Indeed, the medieval mill was more than a building. It was a symbol of advancement, of exploitation, of survival. In Chapter 4, we'll enter the medieval bakery, pausing by the humble village hearth and the grand ovens of city guilds. How was the dough prepared? Who were the bakers? And what mysteries were hidden in the kneading of medieval loaves? Let's keep going. And if you are enjoying this pilgrimage with me, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more medieval deep dives, and leave comments or benedictions down below. With the grain traced from field to mill, we now step into the most fragrant chapter, the medieval bakery. This is where flour met water, salt, yeast, or more likely, sourdough starter, and was kneaded by hand into loaves that would feed villages, cities, abbeys, armies, even kings. In this chapter we investigate the process of turning flour into bread in the Middle Ages. We'll enter the home kitchens of peasants, the communal ovens of a feudal estate, the clanging kitchens of city guilds, and the sacred cookfires of monastic hearths. We'll reveal the day-to-day work, the rituals and the methods that rendered bread the foundation of medieval existence. Ingredients of a medieval loaf. Let's begin with the ingredients. A simple medieval bread might have included flour, wholemeal, or mixed grain for the poor, white refined wheat for the rich, water, often cold or lukewarm, salt, a luxury in some places, so not used all the time. ESP, by peasants, leavening, typically a bit of old dough set aside to ferment early sourdough, or natural yeast. There was no commercial yeast yet. Optional additions: bran, day seeds, herbs, onions, nuts and honey, according to region. Class and season. Luxury bread could be made with milk, eggs and spices such as cinnamon or saffron, or the addition of dried fruit, but these were rare and restricted to special occasions or the upper classes. The art of the bread dough was physically challenging to make, particularly when machines to mix or temperature-controlled proofing boxes were unavailable. Measuring. Ingredients measurements are also not the same as they are today. Bakers baked by feel, handfuls, pinches, scoops. Recipes were oral or taught through apprenticeships. Mixing and kneading flour was then set out into a large wooden trough or bowl. A steady stream of water was added during mixing by hand, or using a paddle. The dough was kneaded. Some bakers kneaded the dough for at least half an hour until it was smooth and elastic. Rural women were especially bakers. With their strong arms and skilled touch, they were the guardians of bread traditions. In the big bakehouses, kneading troughs might be almost as large as bathtubs, and one had to have several workmen to do the kneading of vast lumps of dough. Fermentation, as there was no common baker's yeast. Leavening was dependent on a starter, old dough. Wild yeast. Wild fermentation, letting the dough rise naturally over hours or overnight. This sourdough style fermentation was subject to huge variation according to weather, flour, quality and region. Even bread might taste differently from one village to the next. To the two-day dough, a pre-regional sourdough, processed from the Middle Ages. Bakers would save a piece of the dough each day for use as the starter for the next day. This old dough, which had started to ferment, already carried wild yeast and lactobacilli that would contribute to leavening the next day's loaves. This cyclical, living system created a strong, sour flavor, dense but flavorful bread. Natural preservation. Sourdough kept longer. In a lot of monastic or communal bakeries, the starter was a sacred trust, passed from generation to generation, guaranteeing flavor and tradition from one century to the next. Firing the ovens and now you bake. The most dramatic part of all, types of medieval ovens, clay or stone-domed ovens, shared by a village. These are fired with wood and cleaned before baking. Communal ovens, constructed by the lord or the town, operated by an oven master. Peasants brought dough to bake. Home ovens, uncommon, only for monasteries or rich households. Hearth baking. Bread was placed in an iron pot, covered with the lid, and buried in the ashes of the fire. It was a type of baking, called baking under the cloche. Ovens had to be stoked for hours with bundles of sticks or logs. When the walls were sufficiently hot, the ashes were raked out, and the bread dough was placed directly on the stone floor. No thermostats, no timers. Bakers would judge heat by feel, the color of the oven walls, or by tossing in a handful of flour to see how quickly it browned. Common baking and the Lord's portable stove. In nearly every medieval manor, peasants were not allowed to bake at all during household bake days. They could only bake privately. Instead, they were forced to bake in the oven of the Lord and pay for the privilege, usually in kind with a portion of dough or by forked coin. This created a hub of human relations, gossip, exchange of goods, collective work, monopolies that caused resentment, intermittent covert baking, which was dangerous and punishable. Some peasants even impressed personal seals or marks on their loaves to recognize them when baking was completed. These marks served not only as practical notations, but as well as local art and identity. Bread varieties and shapes. Medieval bread was not uniform. Form, style and type depended on the region, the wealth, and the fact that it was an everyday occasion. Common bread types: maslin bread, multigrain bread, wheat plus rye or wheat plus barley. Widespread in the diet of peasants. Manchet bread, white bread, very fine, soft and costly, partaken of by nobles. Rye bread, dark, chewy, some tartness, now popular in northern and eastern Europe. Horse bread, a sort of coarse bread, made with beans or peas and bran, such as is given to poor people in times of scarcity. Festival bread, adorned with herbs, symbols, or fashioned into animals and crosses. Shapes. Round loaves sold the best, easiest to split. Flatbreads baked up quickly and required no proofing. Braided or shaped loaves began to show up in monasteries or privileged households. Some breads were baked in pans, some in free-form shapes on the stone. Peasants also baked cakes of dough on hot stones or metal griddles near the fire. Salt bread versus saltless bread. Salt, which was necessary but expensive, was taxed by most jurisdictions. In some regions, specialized traditions arose, depending on what was locally available. Tuscany, Italy is known for its saltless bread, or pane cioco, which resulted from having been subjected to a highly taxed salt which was levied by rival cities, such as Pisa, since bread was generally saltless. Salty bread was eaten with a salty food to even it out. Elsewhere, salt was a source of pride. Bakers weighed it out precisely, understanding that it affected not only flavor, but also texture and fermentation. Sacred loaves, bread, and religion. All of medieval bread-making was influenced by religion. In monasteries, bread was baked not only for monks themselves, but for the stream of pilgrims, the poor, and feast days. Bread was sanctified, branded with crosses, or made in tribute to saints. There was often silence in the baking, which was a meditative work. In churches, in addition, hosts were already being made by clerics or by special nuns. It was unleavened, fine, stamped with a holy sign. Alms of bread were distributed, particularly during Lent and holy festivals, holy days, and bread traditions. On Lammas Day, August 1st, the first loaves of the new grain were taken to church for a blessing. For the Easter feast, special plated loaves or loaves shaped like lambs were baked. Bread was not just food, it was symbol, gift, act of devotion. Bakers' guilds and urban regulation. In cities, baking became professionalized. The Bakers' Guild regulated who was eligible to bake and sell bread, set quality standards and prices, enforced weights and measures, trained apprentices and upheld tradition. Bakers had to mark their loaves, frequently with distinctive stamps or molds, and they could face fines for selling underweight or scorched bread. In Paris, the regulations of the bakers of Paris circa 1268 included specific dimensions, weights, and recipes. In London, the assize of bread established prices based on the cost of flour so as to avoid inflation. Bread was another matter, with bread fraud, the adding of sawdust, sand or chalk to loaves, being severely punished. Dishonest bakers in some towns were paraded through the streets with the bad loaves hung around their neck. Bakeries in town and abbey-hot crowded bustling city bakeries. They mixed dough in huge troughs. Men went through the practiced dance of it shaping, scoring, Loading. Ovens could take enough loaves to bake dozens at once. Smoke darkened the walls and the air smelled of roasted flour. Abbeys, which had money and discipline, operated much larger ones, sometimes baking for hundreds of monks, guests, even the poor in the vicinity. Often monasteries had a bakehouse which was built to process grains and baked foodstuffs that produced both holy and everyday bread. Bread and law bread didn't occupy itself on the side of the fork. It moved into the political sphere in times of famine or discord. Governments controlled prices and quantities. The shortages caused grain hoarding, rioting, and the lynchings of bakers in England. The assize of bread and ale referred to it as a usurpation upon consumers who must be protected from that abuse. This was governed by a bread test. Bread testers would weigh and examine bread. Bakers were afraid of these men, who had the authority to close a bakehouse or to punish infractions severely. Bread as social divider. What kind of bread one ate said a lot. The nobles ate puffy, white, leavened loaves, pure wheat, with lots of air in it and lots of prestige. Townspeople ate medium-quality brown bread. Peasants dined on heavy mixed-grain breads, nourishing but rough to the taste. The poor were sometimes given old or rotten bread as charity. But the poorest, plebeians, still demanded some kind of bread at each meal, dipping it in pottage, consuming it with onions, as a means of scooping up food. It was more than food. It was dignity. Conclusion of Chapter 4. In the dancing firelight of the medieval oven, bread took shape, not just as sustenance, but as symbol, identity, labor. So far, then, we have discovered that medieval bread-making depended on expert fermentation and tough kneading by hand, included different ingredients and techniques. According to class and region, it was molded around religious rituals, seasonal rhythms, and legal codes. Happened both in kitchens, bakehouses, and communal ovens. Mirrored a reality in which food could never be taken for granted. In each loaf was a memory of the field, the mill, and of the hands which formed it. In the last few chapters, we have traced a path from the field to the oven with bread. But after loaves were baked, be they in the communal village oven, the abbey's bakehouse, or the firelit workspace of the baker, they didn't just disappear into private homes. Most bread baked in the Middle Ages was bought, sold, or bartered. And this trade created a highly evolved world of markets, laws, taxes, and social resentment. In this chapter, we enter the cobbled streets of a medieval town or city into a world of shouting and jostling, where on flower-laden winds, the price of a loaf could signify peace or protest. This is the tale of bread as an economic force. Markets. The medieval bread economy. Medieval markets were centers of both economic and social life. In the weekly markets and annual fairs, merchants, farmers, artisans, and townsmen all entered into the trade fray. Bread, the most basic food, was an important commodity in these markets. Most towns had bread markets, where bakers or sellers had stalls. In a few of the larger towns, the traffic in bread was of so much importance that it was restricted to certain buildings or porticos, and regulations are found sculptured, like laws written on the pillars of a city, in the very stones of the town. In Paris, for example, the Halas Centrales, by the 12th century, had become a central market. Read it at the Drinker's Companion in London. It was near Cheapside, signifying a connection with commerce. And the traditional itinerant pasta vendor was Grain John, who sold bread and pies. Who sold the bread? The following sold bread by different individuals. Professional baker's bread was produced on a large scale by members of the urban baker guilds, especially for middle-class consumers, or for delivery to institutions such as They used assistants and apprentices, baked several kinds of loaf, and sold it direct from the bakehouse or at market. Women. Sellers. Many bread sellers were women. Washington's hucksters bought bread from bakers, and then sold it from stalls, or from door to door. Some of those were legitimate. Others were cast as scalpers or black market sellers, suspected of hiking their prices or holding on to stale bread. In most cities, women dominated food commerce in such a way that it was the brightest and most exposed sector in the market square. Peasants. More remote areas, rural peasants might bring extra loaves, or even raw dough, to sell or barter. Others traded bread for eggs, cloth, and candles. But all sellers had to be cautious. Bread was strictly regulated, and illegal selling could yield fines, public shame, or confiscation of goods. Loaf law. Bread controlled. The assize of bread was 1. of the oldest and strictly enforced laws in medieval Europe, which dealt with the weight, size, quality, and price of bread. This code, which was first compiled in England in the 13th century, provided that the common weight of a loaf, commonly rooted in the price of grain, the good size for each type of bread, penalties for underweight loaves, or grades of flour that were not represented, ceiling prices to prevent baker or retailer profiteering when there are shortages. England was not alone in having these laws. In towns, duchies and bishoprics across Europe, the same provisions applied. In various cities, bread inspectors or bread weighers, pain testers in France, or gagemen in England would routinely travel to market stalls and bakeries. They carried balancers to weigh loaves, measuring rods to check size, serrated knives for checking texture and airiness. Bread that failed inspection had quick consequences. Punishments for dishonest bakers, punishments for cheating customers on bread were harsh and frequently public. Common punishments included fines, escalating with repeat offenses, all loaves in the windows confiscated, public undesirable public exposure, for instance, walking a town in one's underclothes with stale or underweight loaf draped over the neck, the pillory, a wooden stock in which the offending baker was locked and jeered at. The punishment could be as severe as banishment or imprisonment in times of famine or social upheaval. The baker is one of the most typical of these greater than stump_d_ images, as he is shown being led out of his ear to the market court. In both images are from historic Haberman. Behumti Werkstätten image proposals. Both deliverables would be useful, if well composed, and this wasn't just metaphor. It was a response to actual anger at those who had unfairly profited from hunger. Bread types and pricing tiers. There were many types of bread and prices ranged as follows. Flour type, loaf weight, social class of the Bioguild regulations, seasonal availability, typical bread tiers. Type description: who ate it, Manchitfine white bread nobles, and clergy. Westall bread, high quality white flour, round loaves, upper classes. Guild members, cocked bread, medium quality towns. People, brown bread, wholemeal or mixed grain, peasants, and poor horse bread, barley, beans, and brand livestock. And beggars' prices didn't shift much in good harvest years, but one bad season could mean a doubling or tripling of the price of wheat, and therefore bread prices, an increase of which similar effects were wreaked. In the towns, authorities made use of a sliding price scale. If grain cost a lot, bakers could make smaller loaves for the equivalent price. This was to save the consumer, while still allowing the bakers to live. Bread and taxation. Bread was not traded, it was sold and bought and taxed. Lords could claim a share of all bread sold on their land. Stall fees and licensing charges to sellers accrued to town councils. Monasteries and churches were also often exempt from taxes, leading to friction with lay bakers. Special taxes were levied during festival periods, wars, or famine. Bread also served as a form of tax payment. By Easter, a vassal could pay their rent for the year to the lord in the form of 20 loaves of rye bread, or 100 cocked loaves. In this way, bread was more than just a food. It was forms of currency, tribute, and leverage for rulers. The lord's loaf, feudal bread, dues bread sales in rural areas were frequently linked with feudal duties. A serf's bread required a portion to be rendered to the lord. Manchester lords would perhaps hand out bread during a feast day, or in time of famine, to show that the people's loyalties were appreciated. Bread stores were part of the food rations of castles and manorial estates. A noble giving a feast for dozens or hundreds of people required truckloads of bread, and ordered it weeks in advance. Court and palace bakers were among the most skilled and well-remunerated artisans of the time. Bread, riots and famine. So crucial was bread, in fact, that when it became scarce or too expensive, people took to the street. Causes of bread riots: crop failure, war, cutting supply, roots, grain hoarding by elites, guild corruption, or price fixing. One of the most notorious was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when millions died in Europe. Towns descended into anarchy as bread ran out. Some urban centers recorded raids on bakers' mob, taking their anger out on millers, and baker shooting on the streets of those caught hoarding food in. More of a status quo time. Price rises as small as these could spark protests, particularly among urban workers and the poor. Bread was more than a food. It was a right. And when that right was denied, people were driven to desperation. Export, trade, and the bread trade all though most bread was consumed locally. Flour and grain were part of wider networks of trade. Cities such as Venice, Bruges, Genoa also imported grain and exported baked portions of grain they did not need. Military expeditions relied on contracts, with bakers to provide field rations. The preserved bread hardtack was sustained on merchant ships for long-travel souvenirs. The Hanseatic League of Northern Europe controlled the flow of grain to stabilize the regentart in times of plenty. Towns stockpiled grain in granaries for sale in lean years, an early form of food security. Bread as a social mirror walking through a medieval bread market laid bare the extreme stratification of society. The rich could dispatch servants for white loaves at elite bakeries, haggling at the stalls. The middle class haggled at the stalls, debating the value of quality versus price. The destitute waited until the close of market day for unsold bread to be sold at a discount, or simply given away. Several churches and guilds offered free bread to the poor on the feast days, but there were more frequent lines of beggars pleading for scraps. Bread was the most egalitarian of foods. Everyone required it, but not everyone was able to pay the same. Bread, charity, and faith-sacred institutions intervened to ensure that the poor were monopolizing bread provision. Monasteries baked extra loaves to serve pilgrims and high wayfarers. Legislation on almsgiving led to the free distribution of bread to the poor. Bread tokens, small coins or tokens of wood, referred to in Russia as klebny, number 53,877, erkot, were occasionally distributed and could be exchanged for bread. Throughout Lent and holy holidays, bakers gave bread as a pious gesture. Some guilds would keep public ovens and distribute free loaves every Sunday. In this way, bread was not just business, it was charity, faith, and moral duty. Conclusion of Chapter 5 on the streets and in the stalls of the medieval world. Bread was sold like gold, taxed like land, traded like currency, regulated like law, and gobbled down like life itself. To summarize, markets rotated around bread, with assigned stalls, regulations and prices. Rules were rules, and bakers and vendors faced real penalties for dishonesty. Bread was a mirror of class. The types and the price of the loaf itself was telling of your social class. The shortfalls set off protests, riots, and political change. Eventually, religion and charity corroded the system, delivering loaves to the poor in response to sacred obligation. As the saying went, a town with no bread is a town with no future. We've traced bread from seed to field, mill to oven, market to consumer. And now in this chapter we bring the thing to its ultimate and holiest purpose, the table. When bread was baked and sold, it became much more than food. It was a token of hospitality, the gauge of one's standing, and the linchpin of the medieval meal. It was ripped and shared amid joy, and withheld in punishment, consecrated through ritual, and it was murmured in prayer. Bread was ubiquitous in the medieval world, and from the peasant cottage to the nobleman's table, from the monastic refectory to the village church, the ability to bake bread was a ishing through the power of bread itself, source of widespread prosperity. So how did bread get eaten in the Middle Ages? What was the tradition, faith, and methods connected with its use? And what had a loaf of bread really meant to them, to those who had tasted starvation or luxury beside it? Let's explore. Bread as the main component of the meal throughout much of medieval Europe. A meal without bread was not a meal. The term to break bread had come to mean also to eat, to be hospitable, even to make peace. Bread was. The first dish to come was a table which set on PDF set table, an eating utensil, typically used in place of forks, the final resort in a famine or spot. Meats and pottage, the role of bread by class. Villagers served food on a piece of peasant. Bread course, rye, or maslin bread, which was food and plate all in one. Village bought simple loaves or tore flatbreads with stews. Nobility ate fine manchet bread with their fancy meals, cutting chunky slices with knives made from bone or silver. Monks reign every case. Bread was not so much served as it was the entire meal, to be structured around it. Trencher bread, the edible plate of the Middle Ages perhaps. One of the more interesting medieval customs is that of trenchers, which were not the wooden plates we might envision, but rather slices, or slabs, of stale bread, often several days old, that are cut thick and then laid on the table. These bread trenchers absorbed juices, held food, and were edible, although perhaps not always eaten by the person eating. Leftover trenchers were usually given to servants, dogs, or the poor by the nobility that used them. In monasteries, trenchers were often gathered and given as alms. Trenchers were symbolic as well. Breaking them signified a common bond or contract. And on royal courts, the quality of your trencher was an unambiguous status signal. How bread was made and eaten. Modern table knives did not cut, as were used to cut bread at table. It was ripped by hand, a meaningful gesture in and of itself. To share bread was to share peace, hospitality and humility. In more refined settings, another bread servant may have a cloth-lined basket for the bread. Loaves already had been pre-scored to facilitate tearing. Guests were served personal SOPs, smaller portions, if you will, dunked in sauce. Eating customs varied. In rural houses, bread was put in the center of the table to be shared by all. At aristocratic banquets, it was distributed by rank. Monastic diners might get as much as exactly 8 ounces of bread per day, split between 2 meals. Regardless of class and location, bread was not thrown out lightly. To throw or misuse bread was an offense against respect, gluttony, or impiety. Bread in the diet. How much did they eat? Medieval diets, by our modern standards, were very bread-heavy. Daily bread consumption estimates. Peasants, 1.5 to 2.5 pounds of bread each to manual labor workers, up to 3 pounds, and even more during cold months. Monks' exact quantities. Garments, usually 1 pound, occasionally more during a fast. Nobles, less overall bread, but better quality. Most people's diet consisted mostly of bread, which supplied 50 to 80% of their calories. It was eaten breakfast, if there be any ale, or chocolate, cheese or the like, at the main meal of the day, with vegetables, broth or meat for dinner, cold once in the evening with other food or porridge. In lean times, bread grew thin, dark and diluted, mixed with beans, or acorns, or weeds in order to stretch flour stores. Storing and preserving bread. Medieval bread was used as a plate, and a trencher of stale bread could serve the same function as, and be as greasy as, a piece of toast in soaking up the gravy from a stew. Most people baked only once or twice a week, and found ways to keep their bread common. Techniques. Staling bread was alternatively allowed to get hard, and then served as trenchers, or it was dipped in broth. Drying. It was round as a ball, and varied from the white bread to the penny loaf, which was thick and rusk. A biscuit was a short-distance food, for immediate consumption, like toast, where the bread was toasted before consumption. Crumbing. Hard breads were reduced to crumbs, to thicken sauces, or to feed animals. Hardtack was now days saved. It was soaked in milk, wine or ale, reheated or grated. In the homes of peasants, old bread was transformed into a kind of panada, a poor man's gruel of stale bread and water. Bread and beverages. Bread and ale went hand in hand everywhere. At least the ale provided calories, hydration, and mild intoxication. The bread substance. Other pairings included. The very first thing to be offered on such an occasion would, especially for children or sick folks, be bread and milk, bread and wine, especially in the nobile homes or during communion. Bread and onion, a working man's menu. Does bread soaked in gravy in fact precede many of our medieval sauces? Breads were smacked around, flavored, even eaten in ritual combinations. Garlic bread before battle, honeyed bread for weddings. Bread in feasts and celebrations. Special occasions were cause for special bread. Festival breads. Lammas bread, a church service to share at the first wheat harvest. Easter loaves, lambs, crosses or twists, enriched with eggs or raisins. Christmas bread, seasoned, and in some cases sweetened, and given to guests and children. Bridal bread, covered in flowers, or piled in pyramids, ancestors of the cake. Loaves also form part of symbolic rituals. Bread put out at window for the dead. Bread burial in the fields, for the nature spirits. Casting breadcrumbs into rivers for good fishing. All of these practices were grounded in the deep conviction that bread was alive, with spirit and power. The table, wall, and bread, religion. Bread was the centerpiece of Christian ritual, and all meals offered a daily gesture to the sacred, praying or blessing the food. Before eating was practiced by most homes, even the most simple and farmer type, usually by the eldest of the family. In monastic refectories, eating in silence was enforced with a lector reading from the scriptures as the monks ate higher. 2011. The monk's food intake was also monitored with a small portion of bread and a modest portion of soup. Bread was also for teaching morality. So when God does give, waste God's giving. Not a sin shared is half a sin, but a loaf shared is the whole of a sin forgiven. Uneaten bread did not go into the trash. It was dried and donated to the poor or reverently burned. Bread as hospitality and power. Bread was an important tool of display and diplomacy in noble courts. Giving a guest a loaf of white bread was a signal of wealth and standing. The practice of giving bread as a gift existed between deity and vassal. In some castles, silver or bronze bread medallions were struck to foster goodwill. If you were invited to dinner at a noble's house, one of the first things you noticed when you walked into that banquet hall was the bread. How white it was, how soft it was, what shape it was in. In peasant villages, the giving of bread often sealed alliances or kinship. Breaking bread together was not mere metaphor, it was a literal demonstration of trust. Bread in times of famine and judgment. All bread was warm and celebratory. In famine, bread was rationed by the ounce. So little it was cut in the reverse of the usual thin slices, and it was stretched with ground bark or beans. Some of the loaves were grey-green and nearly inedible. Whole villages went weeks without good baking. In prison, prisoners were not offered much beyond bread and water, the foods of penance and control. The kind and quantity were based on the crime. For some monasteries, it was a discipline to make the monks eat vegetarian meals. In plague, there were some places where bread was being baked in quarantine, made up and passed out, and a lot of stories or sticks left at town gates. Charcoal crosses were made on loaves to show that they were safe. Bread, death, and the afterlife. Bread was a piece of death, as it was of life. A custom still associated with St. Bridget is the sharing of funeral bread during wakes, sometimes formed into elaborate shapes or with inscriptions. Soul loaves were deposited on church altars for the good of the souls in purgatory. In some folk traditions, bread was put under the dying person's pillow or in their coffin. The superstition was that giving bread for the soul of a deceased loved one smoothed his or her way to heaven. Conclusion of Chapter 6. To eat bread in the Middle Ages was to share in history, community, and faith. For each one contained within it the memory of the field, the weight of work, the hum of prayer, and the rituals of the table. To summarize, all meals featured bread, from the poorest cottage to the grandest hall. It was plate, utensil, and offering. Forcing bread to tear was a social act, a means of solidarity. Bread embodied feast and famine, life and death, faith and family. With bread, the medieval world discovered more than mere sustenance. It found meaning. Bread was never simply bread in the Middle Ages. It was a mystery of the divine, a symbol of life and death, a theological battleground, and a path to heaven. To modern eyes, a loaf of bread can appear a humble, even mundane object, but medieval Christendom treated bread as sacred, exalted, terrifying, fought over, worshipped. In this chapter, we leave the fields and baker kilns and enter the cathedrals, abbeys, and sacred hearts of medieval Europe. We will find out how a simple loaf of bread was transformed into the body of Christ, how it was defined and contested across centuries of doctrine and heresy, how it became central to the very idea of miracles, to the acts, words, and life of Jesus, how the bread appeared in rituals, legends, accusations, and inquisitions, and why medieval people were willing to die over bread. Bread as body, the transubstantiation doctrines at the heart of medieval Christianity was the Eucharist, the ceremony known as Holy Communion or the Mass, and the center of that ritual was bread. What was the Eucharist? A religious ceremony in which worshippers ate bread and drank wine in memory of Jesus Christ's Last Supper. The bread was Christ's body, the wine his blood. It was not a metaphor to medieval Catholics. It was quite literally believed to be transformed into the body of Christ by the 13th century, a miracle called transubstantiation. Transubstantiation defined: the substance of the bread was thought to change into the body of Christ. Its accidents, the way it looks, tastes, smells, would still be there. This transformation could only be carried out by an ordained priest as part of the Mass. By 1215 Fourth Lateran Council, this belief had become central to Catholic doctrine, and a denial of it was heresy. The communion bread form in history. It wasn't some normal loaf given out as they passed it around in communion. Features of Eucharistic bread, unleavened, on the basis of nothing but wheat, flour, and water, for use in the Latin Church, baked into thin white wafers, cross-embossed, generally with the cross or sacred symbols stamped on open books, touched only by priests, and occasionally nuns who baked the hosts in a hushed reticence. The ritual, the bread was consecrated by the priest. In the altar, that's when the bell was rung. When his form changed, it was made as a signal to the store's congregation that a miracle had occurred. The host was then raised, lifted above the priest's head, for all to see. However, usually only the priest ate both the bread and drank the wine. Ordinarily, the laity were given the bread alone. This elevation of the host, it was said, was the spiritual high point of the Mass. Many believed that simply looking at the consecrated bread could impart grace or cure sickness. Sight worship, the cult of the sacred hosts. Medieval believers not only ate the sacred bread, they gazed on it, venerated it, and even worshipped it. Elevation and adoration. It was a crush to see the consecrated host. Richer parishioners paid to sit near the altar. In a few towns, the church bells marking elevation were how a day was kept. Corpus Christi. Corpus Christi, a feast devoted to the body of Christ, was declared in 1264 by Pope Urban IV. The Eucharistic bread was carried in processions through towns in ornate vessels known as monstrances. Streets were swept, houses decked with garlands, and bread was venerated with incense, song, and prayer. These practices were representative of a society that believed it could see Christ in the loaf, not figuratively, but actually and tangibly. Bread miracles and legends. Lots of stories were going round about consecrated bread with miraculous power, Eucharistic miracles, hosts that bleed when stuck or dropped, bread transforming visibly into flesh, ill or dying persons who had touched or had received the host. Famous examples: the miracle of Bolsena, 1263. A skeptical priest noticed the host to be bleeding during Mass. From this developed Corpus Christi, the miracle of Santa in Porto. A snatch of host bled in a woman's home and kept unscathed for hundreds of years. Many reports of thieves or animals not destroying hosts attest to its divine character. These narratives were faith-affirming and confirmed doctrine in the eyes of believers, particularly the illiterate hordes, for whom, why, miracles like these were the proof of the pudding. Heresy and the war on bread, but not all. Christians accepted the Church's attitude toward bread. Dissenting sects arose from the 12th century that questioned the belief in the transubstantiation of the bread into Christ's body. The Cathars rejected the Eucharist altogether, thought material world was bad, including bread, saw rituals as meaningless. The Lollards and later Reformers denied transubstantiation, urged symbolical interpretation, presence of Christ only in a spiritual sense. He attacked priestly power and church corruption. These views were dangerous. The Church's response: heretics were sought, tried, and burned. The very laity who simply questioned the Eucharist could be excommunicated, imprisoned, and killed. The Eucharist was turned into a litmus test of orthodoxy. The bread doctrine was the covenant between the faithful and the refusal to recognize its efficacy was like rejecting life itself. Bread, magic, and the occult beyond the Church. Bread had a place in folk belief and magic, a shadow world of customs that either preyed upon official religion or mixed in with it curses and charms. Bread from the altar in spells of protection. Stolen hosts supposedly used in love potions or weather magic. Small pieces of consecrated bread were lodged in fields to ensure a good crop. Such practices were condemned by the Church as sacrilege or witchcraft, but continued in the countryside for centuries. The witch trials, women charged with theft of the host for diabolic rituals, of blasphemy of bread, of baking unholies, or treading underfoot sprinkled excrement in novelettes. These allegations rarely had any basis in fact, but they did fan the flames of popular fear. Bread, already religiously symbolic, became a focus of moral panic. Bread and penanster, Eucharistic bread, was not received automatically. One had to confess sins fast beforehand. In a state of grace since the Middle Ages, most people had only received communion once a year, at Easter. It was a solemn and terrifying act that called for spiritual preparation. In some cases, to refuse the host was to protest or deny the faith. Excommunicating someone from communion was a huge punishment, a kind of social and spiritual exile. Even common bread began to play penitential parts. The bread and water of penal monks, fasts of bread and water from sunrise to sunset for spiritual cleansing, and bread and water in the evening, penitence bread, used in acts of restitution, feed the poor. Bread and death, final communion at the approach of death. Bread served one more sacred function. Viacum: a special form of the Eucharist to the dying. It is also said to reinvigorate the soul for its ascent to the afterlife, performed by priests, who usually do it with ritual and haste. The host was borne with candles and bells through the streets to the bedside of the expiring. People knelt as it passed. Never minded death, there's still bread, earth's life and what's left of it. Outside the Latin West, the bread of the Eastern Church, ritual meaning of bread in the Eastern Orthodox Church. The bread signified with different ritual meanings. Had Eucharist made with leavened bread to symbolize the risen Christ. Baked in molds, bearing sacred inscriptions, pieces were cut and solemnly passed around. Orthodox theology also opposed the Roman doctrine of transubstantiation, which created centuries of theological tension. Although doctrinally divided, the bread was central to the faith of Christendom on both sides. Bread architectures, tabernacles and altars. The sacredness of bread was represented also in church architecture. Consecrated hosts were stored in special containers known as tabernacles. Sanctuaries were constructed with raised altars to permit elevation. Monstrances, sunburst-shaped receptacles, disclosed hosts to the faithful in public devotion. Whole cathedrals were constructed to emphasize the instant of the bread's transformation into Christ, with stained glass, arches and orientation conspiring to direct the viewer's eye to the altar. Bread and charities. The demand that we say, "Give us this day the bread that is our due," was literal, not metaphorical. The practice of distributing bread charitably became an important part of Christian duty. Loaves were distributed daily by monasteries to the poor. Bread hospitals, or almshouses, were founded and endowed by the well-to-do. Bread was consecrated and handed out on feast days and at funerals. Bread fountains were also present in some towns, where bread was placed for anyone to take who was unable to pay for it. These were not simply acts of kindness, they were thought to atone for sin and reduce time spent in purgatory. Conclusion of Chapter 7. Bread was holy in the medieval world. It was shattered at the altar, then eaten in faith. It was slugged out in councils and whispered in heresy trials. It was ground by wheat and hands, but changed by spirit and faith. 2. Summarize: the Eucharist made bread into a miracle, the body of Christ itself. Rituals of bread, molded church architecture, daily prayers and sacred art, debates over bread, heresy, violence and reform. Herb. Edible bread also occurred in folk magic, miracles, and rites associated with the end of life. The meekest crumb could be blessed, cursed, or saved. And by now, we've followed the travels of bread through the fields, through the markets, through the monasteries, and even into the chalice of Christian belief. But behind each loaf, chewed by a peasant, presented in a noble's feast, or raised during the Mass, stood a modest and laboring figure, the baker. In this chapter, we descend to the sweat and fire of the bakehouse. We will follow the daily rhythms of the medieval baker, from midnight wake-up calls to already blistered hands, from dough-stained aprons to the scorn of town authorities. We'll visit the men and women who fed whole communities, find out the secrets of their ovens and the social role they played, not just as bakers but also as custodians of survival. For to be a baker in the Middle Ages was not a job, it was a way of life. Who were the bakers? The bakers of the Middle Ages were not peasants cooking bread for his own family. They were trained professionals, and in towns, at least, their work was controlled, observed and needed. Types of bakers: town bakers, guild bakers, or by trade licensed men in towns. Frequently they owned their own baking equipment, or were employed by those in community bakehouses. Monastery bakers, monks who had been given the duty to bake for monastery, pilgrims or the needy. Castle bakers, used in noble households. These were bakers who catered to the needs of large retinues. Village bakers, fewer, perhaps someone hired to make use of the Lord's oven or bake for a fee. Woman bakers often had small, family-owned shops or peddled bread through the streets and markets. Bakers were, in many towns, ranked along with craftsmen as part of the skilled working class. They tended to live on the edge of comfort, never starving, but scarcely rich. The baker's daily routine bread baking wasn't done in the morning. It was done in the pitch black of night. A typical day, midnight to 2 a.m. Wake up and start the oven, typically a stone hearth that had to be fired for hours. 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. mix the dough. Knead the dough in huge quantities. 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. start baking first batches to deliver to the early market. 6:10 a.m. keep baking, cooling, sorting, and packing things up to be delivered 10 a.m. to noon. Take bread at market stalls or let hucksters buy for resale. Afternoon, scour ovens, mend tools, see guild officers. Have flour ready for 2-moro. Bakers labored 6 to 7 days a week, the only break coming on Sunday, and on some ovens. Even this day was commandeered as a working day, for given the high demand. The medieval bakehouse, be it attached to a city street, located inside a monastery, or tucked within a manor estate, the bakehouse was usually a cramped, hot, smelly place. Main components. The oven, typically constructed of brick or stone and shaped like a dome, heated with firewood or charcoal. After the hearth was warm, the ashes were taken out of it and the bread put in. Mixing troughs, wooden or stone bowls, where flour, water, and leaven were placed, and mixed by hand or with a wooden paddle. Proofing boards, tables or shelves at which the dough rose prior to baking. Peels, long-handled wooden paddles to slide loaves in and out of the oven. Cooling racks, tables with slats of wood or woven baskets, where bread was set out to cool before it was offered for sale. The bakehouse smelled of yeast and ash, of bursting crusts and rustling sacks, and of the long-lasting fires that never really went out. Tools, skills, and techniques. Baking was an exacting science to little fermentation, and the loaf was flat and dense. Too much heat, and it burned. Key skills of a baker: dough judgment, when it was the right mix, without looking at clocks or thermometers. Fire mastery, forging an oven to the right temperature without a gauge, and keeping it there. Timing, juggling the space and time of multiple batches at different proofing stages. Recipe flexibility, making a different loaves for different flours, classes, and seasons. Bakers were also expected to calculate bread, weight, and size according to local bread laws, respond to changing grain prices, and maintain good relationships with millers, farmers, and customers. The baker was, in other words, half artist, half engineer, and half mathematician. Apprenticeships and guilds. You couldn't just decide you wanted to bake bread and become a baker. You had to train, sometimes for years. The path: apprentice 10 to 14, apprentice to a master for training. Duties included firing ovens, scrubbing, lugging flour, and waiting for dough to rise. Journeyman 16 to 20, can bake solo but hasn't quite reached master status, could pick up experience from traveling between towns. Master baker had shop apprentices and became a guild member. Bakers' guilds, to be met with at every considerable town. A broad regulated loaf size and price, hours of operation, quality of bread, and exams for apprentices provided legal protection. Burial assistance, support in disputes. Exile from a guild was exile from a livelihood, reputation, and future. Profit and pressure. Though bakers were essential workers, they faced pressure from the government, the market, and their customers. GOT challenges: price controls. Fixed by Loaf, wheat went up. They had to reduce loaves of bread rather than increase prices. Inspections: loaves were weighed and officials checked, often for quality. A simple mistake might cost you fines or public embarrassment. High overhead, fuel for ovens, sacks of flour, labor, all cut into profits. Risk of spoilage: bread that was not sold turned stale fast. Profit margins, often slim. Richer bakers were able to stay in business by selling to institutions like monasteries, castles, or the military. Local custom and word of mouth also sustained little bakers, however hard they tried. Some bakers were occasionally suspected of cheating, hoarding flour, or selling underweight loaves. In times of famine or food shortages, they were the object of public anger. Women in baking. Although men occupied a lot of the official baker posts, women dominated, particularly in homemade baking for sale, particularly in rural villages. Street hawking, disposing of bread. Husband or master had baked. In bakehouses, shaping, or at ovens. Widow bakeries, running widow bakeries when husbands died. Many women took over the business. Women also worked as bakers, at least in London and Paris. even if as a rule they never became full masters. Health and risk in the bakehouse. Baking was tough, physical, risky work. Common health hazards: burns from stoves, warm bread or charcoal. Lung problems, because she inhaled flour, dust and smoke daily. Back strain from lifting sacks of flour or stooping over ovens. Scratches, sores and infections, courtesy of tools, wooden boards and a wealth of moisture. In larger bakehouses, injuries were a common occurrence, and some of the guilds had created funds to which injured members could apply. The baker's place in society. Baker were in a complex social position, prized for their talent and necessary commerce, hated for the prospect of exploiting hunger. He is someone who is regulated for the public trust and is also in times of crisis. Their lives were intimately intertwined with the church, entailing donations of bread to the poor, tithes and holy days. Some achieved local prominence, even as town officials or rich merchants. Then others lived on the edge, punished for even small infractions. The reputation of bakers were immortalized in as enterprising tradesmen or scheming cheats. Association mark commonly a loaf, a peel, or a fire. Satire and poetry, where underweight loaves represented sin or decay. In many towns, bakers had to take oaths before the council. Bake fairly, avoid mixing inferior flour, sell at just prices, offer honest weights. The baker's reputation was everything. Notable historical bakers. There were bakers who became well known in their time. Jean Le Fournier of 13th century Paris, a master baker who contributed bread to the sick and supported a leper's hospital. The widow Magda of Lübeck, a 6th century female bakery owner who operated for more than 30 years and was credited in local chronicles as feeding the poor during a grain crisis. Brother Albrecht, a Benedictine monk in Germany who was famous for his holiday breads that included dried fruits and spices. However, their names are largely gone, but these bakers molded the daily routine of thousands. Conclusion of Chapter 8. There was a scorch-marked pair of medieval bakers' hands behind every loaf, be it simple or sacred. To summarize, bakers were well-skilled workers, typically organized in guilds. They labored excruciating hours, often at night, in dangerous conditions. Their existences were regimented, hazardous and seldom secure, yet indispensable. Many bakers were helping to sustain entire communities, feeding the poor and making sure society did not fall apart from hunger. They were craftsmen and nurturers, unseen backbenchers of medieval culinary life, transforming the flour into sustenance, the ovens into hope. In Chapter 9, we'll visit something darker: what occurred when bread vanished. We will venture through the horrifying realities of famine, of war, of plague, and learn how societies adapted and how they crumbled when the ovens went cold. Thanks, as always, for reading. If you enjoyed this tale, tell us in the comments. And never forget, like the baker's fire, history requires tending. We have walked through the sun-silvered fields of grain, listened to the creak of the millstones, stood beside the fires of the ovens, and knelt before the holy altars where bread became God. But in this chapter we are facing the darkness that descended when bread vanished, when the farms yielded nothing, when wagons returned packed with only sorrow, when the tiniest crumb was a matter of life and death. But medieval Europe was stalked by the perennial fear of famine. Bread, so essential to existence, was also terrifyingly fragile. A bad harvest, a disrupted supply chain, an increase in war, or an outbreak of disease or pestilence could do it, leaving whole communities teetering on the brink of mass starvation. Within weeks, this chapter is about the terrible aftermath of bread shortages, the social pall and disorder, the sheer panic and alienation, the attempts to find alternative sustenance, and the awful inventiveness of people simply trying to survive in a world that had been deprived of the most basic items of human diet. The fine balance, why bread was always vulnerable. In order to understand medieval famine, we need to understand just how precarious the food system was. The agricultural reality: 3. Medieval farming was hard work, with a poor yield that was heavily dependent on the weather. Grain crops, especially wheat, were vulnerable to rain during harvest droughts or floods. Rodents and pest diseases like ergot or mildew. Peasants did not have advanced tools or chemical fertilizers. A single bad year could deplete reserves. A second bad year could spell famine. Bread and supply chains: not most people, who didn't have years' worth of grain, The grain sold seasonally and was soon eaten. A lack of transport opportunity offered little redistribution from surplus areas. That anxiety and worry became so prevalent, and it infected every part of the bread system. He said, the cost of a loaf, the economics of grain in crisis bread prices were well regulated. But when the spectre of famine appeared, the markets became vicious. Price inflation, if the grain was withheld, the price shot up. Local officials attempted to regulate the price of bread, but bakers didn't want to bake if they couldn't turn a profit. This led to hoarding Royet's black market trading. The rise of substitute breads. One of the worst results of a bad harvest wasn't just hunger, it was social panic. As the normal cycle of bread making collapsed, historical famines and bread riots. Consider three great famines in which bread was at the heart of the breakdown. The Great Famine of 1315-17, and attributed to relentless rain and cold across northern Europe. Grain rotted in the field, animals drowned, roads were washed away, bread grew scarce and uninspired. Made with pea, flour, bark, moss, and worse. Cannibalism is said to have occurred in some places in Flanders and Poland. Chroniclers described women eating their own children. But we should tread carefully with these stories. This famine killed millions and left millions more with permanent physical and mental damage. Paris food riots, known as the flour riots of Paris c. 1529 to 1530. There were bread riots in urban markets due to the shortage of wheat flour. Bakers were accused of hoarding grain or selling loaves that were too small. Mobs raided bakeries, taking bread and wheat by force. The royal army put down the uprising, but frustrations lingered. Riots like this took place all over medieval Europe during bread shortages, with bakers, millers, or grain merchants the usual objects of wrath. Famine. During the Black Death, 134–71352, the plague claimed somewhere between 1/3 to 1/2 of the continent's population. For want of workers, fields went unplowed and harvests rotted. More than bread disappeared in many places, and for more than the privileged in some cities. The dead lay near the empty ovens, no one to mill, bake, or deliver. During the plague, there were no bread shortages. Naturally, there were only shortages when society collapsed. Desperate measures, when there was no wheat. Such options included alternatives that were often bad for you, or unpalatable, or just downright dangerous. Common substitutes for grain: pea and bean flour ground, acorns, no, we are not joking, tree bark, particularly birch or elm moss or lichen weeds, and wild herbs, ground animal bones or blood. These replacements were frequently ground and mixed with stale flour and baked into what was sometimes referred to as famine cakes or black loaves. They were dry and hard to chew in nutrition. Sometimes poisonous acorns and bark needed to be soaked or leached to get rid of tannins used only in extreme hunger. Despite this, folks lined up for hours or quarreled over morsels of such loaves. The curse of ergot, the poisoned LOA. The poisoned LOA, one of the scariest conditions associated with bread scarcity, was ergotism, known as St. Anthony's fire. What is ergot? A fungus disease common on rye and other grain, especially in wet seasons. Consuming ergot-infected bread caused hallucinations, burning, sensations in limbs, gangrene, convulsions, and death outbreaks. France had 40,000 deaths due to ergotism in the year 944 AD. Monasteries started to take in the sick, which eventually evolved in 2 hospitals, operated by the Order of St. Anthony. Some areas considered ergotism divine retribution or witchcraft. In years of famine, hungry people frequently consumed moldy grain, unaware that it's capable of wreaking havoc. Social collapse and class inequality. Bread was literally cut from social fabric during famines. The upper classes hoarded flour, eating white loaves in secret. The poor either died in the streets or squabbled over crusts. A few of the nobility gave away bread as charity, receiving political support. Others declined to share, protected their bakeries with gunmen. Bread charities. Churches occasionally distributed free bread to the impoverished during a famine, known as God's loaves. Monasteries expanded soup kitchens. Bread tokens were issued to the needy in areas such as Venice or Florence, but such endeavors were seldom sufficient. Hunger led to mass migrations, theft, and murder. Collapse of law and order. Bread, which used to be a symbol of life and community, had become a source of division and despair. Punishing bakers and grain merchants. Authorities said they often sought a scapegoat. Common accusations: bakers charged with bad flour, false weights, or mixing sawdust into the dough. Grain dealers who hoarded or exported grain during a famine were also arrested. Millers charged with hoarding flour for profit. Punishments, public whippings, or stocks forced distribution of grain. Renegade rioters, executors in worst scenario when the situation is most critical. Seizure of ovens, forced baking on reduced rates. This climate of suspicion made famine time baking a perilous profession. Bread, sin, and divine punishment indeed. Many people thought that famines were generated by sin. Bread was not coming. People felt, because God was punishing human wickedness. Pageantry of prayer and fasting went up, that from rain or forgiveness were drawn back. Orders of monks and priests preached sermons on gluttony, hoarding, failure to help the poor. In one village, some men performed the Last Supper. In another, a man broke loaves as if in church. In yet another, villagers set bread upon the altars of the saints. Bread became part penance, part nourishment. Long-term effects of bread shortages. Famine had permanent effects on medieval society. Demographic shifts. Many survivors would abandon villages and travel elsewhere in search of food. Wastelands were frequent, and the character of land use changed. In England after 1317 there was a movement towards sheep farming due to the greater profitability of sheep, compared to grain in areas with higher risk. Labor and economics. In the wake of the Black Death and related famines, labor was worth more. Lower-paid workers demanded higher wages, and feudal control waned. This contributed to the end of serfdom in many parts of Europe. Ironically, the lack of bread helped pave the way for social change. Bread in memory and folklore. The trauma of starvation remained deeply etched. Folk practices. Children instructed not to throw even crumbs out. Country festivals enjoined the blessings of bread and grain to guard against future famine. Stories of breadless years were handed down through generations. Some regions commemorated survival with loaves of famine, bread baked annually in remembrance of food deprivation. Ghost meals, symbolic feasts prepared for the souls of those who had died of hunger. These practices revealed that the lack of bread could be as culturally potent as the presence of a loaf. Conclusion of Chapter 9. Bread was life, but its lack exposed the fragility of that life. The fields would go fallow, the ovens cold and markets empty, and the medieval world confronted its own helplessness. To summarize, the production of bread was ever precarious, dependent on nature. War, disease, famine produced desperate improvisation, social unrest and mass death. Alternate breads were either dangerous or ineffective, ergot and contaminated. Grains led to disease and misery. The lack of bread transformed social, economic, and spiritual life. Bread became much more than food. It was a symbol of survival and memory. In Chapter 10, we shall move to another kind of history, the legal and political history of bread. How did bread become governed, regulated, taxed, weighed, and standardized? What laws surrounded its sale? What were the consequences for breaking the rules of the bread? Let's take a bite out of bread law and the medieval justice system. In the Middle Ages, bread was more than just an essential part of the diet. It was powerfully political. It was so basic, so ever-present, and, during times of shortages, so subject to abuse that kings, lords, bishops, city councils, even guilds, passed laws and attempts to regulate it, from the weight of a loaf to the purity of the flour, from who could sell it to its tax treatment. Bread was one of the most strictly regulated commodities in the medieval economy. This chapter plunges us into the realm of medieval bread law, the edicts, statutes, inspections, price controls, punishments, and protections that encircled every crust of bread. We'll consider how the law both defined the role of the baker and protected the ordinary customer, and sometimes came down with histrionic force in order to make an example out of someone for breaking the rules. Welcome to the courtroom where you summon a breadbasket to fight. Why regulate bread? The regulation of bread was not merely a question of fairness. It was about public order and also nutrition and political stability. Core motivations: avoid mass hunger in a famine. Unregulated prices could lead to riots and death. Prevent fraud. Bakers may pass off lightweight loaves or mix offensive fillers to gain by high grade. Keep the trust. Bread was life itself. It had to be honest. Reinforce urban control. Although local government regulate the bread in cities to show that they had the power, and also wanted to ensure the overall welfare. As one medieval official wrote, Let no man deceive the belly of the poor, for the peasant's hunger is God's wrath. The assize of bread. Medieval bread law. In practice, the assize of bread and ale was one of the most important bread laws in Europe. The English Assize of 1266, published in the time of Henry III, fixed the prices and weights of bread according to the price of wheat, stratified for urban and rural bread sellers, required public listing of prices, controlled bread components, and bakers' ways. In the centuries that would follow, it was reissued and amended dozens of times. Some other European cities had also such laws. Paris under the Métiers codes. Florence in the Ordinanze della Biada. German towns using municipal statutes. Especially for a country entering a crisis. These laws were instruments of governance and not discretionary guidelines. Bread by the numbers, price and weight systems. Since wheat prices fluctuated, the law permitted varying the size of the loaf, not the price. How it worked: low costs of wheat gives large loaves. If wheat cost a lot, gives loaves were smaller. The price per loaf was more or less fixed, generally amounting to a farthing or penny. Example: a penny loaf might weigh 6 pounds in year goods. In only years of famine, that penny loaf could weigh 10 ounces. That meant bread stayed cheap. But honesty was required to do a deal. Authorities released new tables, known as bread scales, that enumerated current legal weights. Inspections and the bread police. Bread laws weren't idle. Inspectors enforced them, called by an assortment of titles: Elconners, England Guard, Day Pains, France Weighman, or Lars Market, Sergeants Guild Wardens. Their duties included weighing loaves on scales at markets and bakeries, looking for the right mix of ingredients, no sawdust, clay, or bad flour, examining bakehouses to see that they are kept clean and in order, inspecting flour mills for any tampering or blending, testing bakers' measures, like scoops and scales. They served under civic or royal officials and were the terror of bakers. Punishments for breaking bread. Lawbreakers who were found to be in violation of bread law were subjected to everything from fines to public embarrassment. Common offenses: selling underweight loaves, using banned ingredients, hoarding flour, baking without a license. Overcharging. Penalties: fines made to the city or lord, sometimes in proportion to the trespass. Common punishment: bakers put in public stocks with poor quality bread hanging from their necks. Oven destruction: uncommon, but metaphorical. Exile: habitual offenders might be banished, forced free. Baking: sentenced to bake bread for indigent persons at his expense. In certain towns, bread felons paraded in the streets, charred loaves asphyxiating them, as the public taunted. The Lord's Oven. Feudal baking rights in rural areas. The story was different. Manorial control. Several lords owned the village's single oven. Peasants had to grind their grain there, in addition to paying to use it and sacrificing a fee or toll of their bread. This right was known as banalite France, or signoral dues. The Lord's Oven was a source of revenue, a symbol of authority, a source of resentment, in particular when peasants were fined for baking at home. Such conflicts over this control became violent at times, or resulted in rebellions. Certain peasant revolts in France in the 14th and 15th centuries involved the burning of the Lord's bakehouse. Bread guilds and self-regulation in cities. The guilds of bakers were frequently the initial source of regulation. Guild functions: trained apprentices, set quality standards. Supervised prices in coordination with city councils, investigated complaints. Guilds had an internal court to resolve differences among members. If a guild member sold bad bread, gives scolded or fined, but in the end it was simply spoke ill of another baker, gives punished. Trained unapproved apprentices, gives expelled. Guilds shielded their members, but they also shielded the public trust. The successful operation of the entire endeavor depended on everybody abiding by the rules. Bread taxes and tithes. Bread itself was taxed in most places before it could even get to the oven. Types of taxes: milling taxes, some of your grain, to the miller or lord. Bakehouse dues for use of ovens. Market imposts levied for selling bread at stalls. Tithes: 10% of your bread, grain, was given to the church. Rebellious bakers, confectioners were more tightly controlled in the cities, where they were kept on a tight lead with the help of a complex system of tax checks. Refusal was likely to bring loss of a license, fines, or worse, Bread was not just a food, it was an income. Bread for the poor. The charity doctrine, regulated lots of statutes, regulated the provision of bread to the poor. The cities enacted regulation to compel bakers to contribute a number of loaves on holy days, or, in times of need. They were the monasteries, responsible to canon law for dispensing alms in the form of bread. Endowments occasionally supported eternal bread. Free loaves given out daily in memory of the deceased. The distribution of these funds was closely monitored and controlled to inhibit fraud. If bakers cheated the poor, they might be subject to harsher penalties than if they cheated the rich. Case study. The price of bread in 14th century Paris. Let's explore Paris under the Capetian kings. All baking was controlled by the Corporation des Ballingers. Bakers had to swear loyalty to the city, use approved weights and ovens, display bread openly for inspection. Inspectors came weekly, sometimes daily. Penalties for short loaves included a fine of 5 sous to banishment. The law also governed bakery hours, ingredient, sourcing bakers' apprentices, conduct a holiday baking guidelines. For example, no baking on holy days without consent. The bread law in Paris would serve as a model for other cities throughout France and eventually all of Europe. Bread laws and social psychology. There was a psychological as well as practical use for bread regulations. Why it mattered. Fair bread kept the peace, holding back riots and revolts. Public punishments were a way of reassuring people that there was such a thing as justice. Uniform bread weight engendered confidence in authorities. As the historian E.P. Thompson would later write in his History of Bread Law in England, the price and the honesty of bread formed the moral economy of the poor. Governments in the Middle Ages knew this instinctively, and they policed bread with as much ferocity as they allocated to coinage or heresy. When bread law collapsed, the causes for all this regulation, things could, and often did, slip through. Common failures, corrupt inspectors or guild leaders, secret price, manipulation, smuggling of flour or grain, political favoritism for elite, bakers. In warlike times or seasons of plague or famine, these systems collapsed. When that happened, bread vanished, trust eroded. People started getting into vigilante justice. On more than one occasion in the history of the Middle Ages, a loaf too small or too dear had been the signal of a general revolt. Conclusion of Chapter 10. Bread was never just bread. It was a contract, a pledge, a symbol of justice. And so, it was encircled by laws, thousands of them, meant to guarantee that what the oven produced was honest, nourishing, and fair. To summarize, bread itself was the most controlled food of the Middle Ages. Prices and weights of loaves were pegged to grain costs through the publication of tables. Guilds, markets, and civic authorities combined forces to uphold standards. Bakers were subject to frequent inspections and heavy penalties. Bread law brought security and stability, trust and public confidence until it didn't. Bread wasn't just the staple around which the medieval table was set. It was also the focal point of ritual and celebration. In this chapter, we celebrate the spirit in bread, the world of harvest festivals, saints' days, holy days, marriage feasts, funerals, and even seasonal superstitions. We will look at why bread, so modest in its contents, became a canvas on which to study art, belief, joy, and memory. We're going to see how each season boasted its signature bread, made with rural ingredients, how people thanked, through flour and fire, how bread influenced not only the body, but an entire ritual calendar. This is a tale of holy loaves, symbolic crusts and crumb-studded customs that have made meaning out of the staff of life. Bread beyond the belly, how it became symbolic. Before we explore particular rituals and feasts, it's worth wondering, why bread? Bread was widespread. Bread was a part of the daily diet for everyone, from the serfs to the king. Transformative, a bushel of grain is not a loaf of bread. Turning grain into bread is hard, skilled work that takes time. Communal, typically made in common space, eaten together and bound to the land. Sacred, associated with divine narratives, from the body of Christ to pagan fertility rites. It was why bread came to represent life, death, time, thankfulness, and sanctity. Every culture that baked bread incorporated it into its festivities. Harvest bread and autumn rituals. The oldest and most widespread bread ritual of the medieval calendar was the harvest festival, a time to give thanks for grain, guarantee the next year's fertility, and bake with whimsy. Lammas, The first loaf observed in England and other parts of northern Europe on August 1st. La messe comes from loaf mass. The first baked loaf made from the new wheat crop was brought to church by the people. The bread was also blessed and sometimes given to the priest or poor. Now and then, the loaf could be broken up and thrown on the fields for a blessing and protection. The la messe loaf was frequently in ornamented shape into sheaves of wheat birds, crosses, or grain. Spirit's face cake, representing the spirit of the field in most pagan-controlled areas. This was said to also free the grain spirit, making it possible for next year's crop to grow. Saints' Day breads and holy loaves in medieval Europe. The religious calendar was punctuated by feasts, and each feast was served its own ritual breads. Saint Honor Baking Day, May 16, Saint Feast Day, May 16th. One was the 6th century bishop of Amiens, Saint Honor, who was later declared to be the patron saint of bakers. Bakers in France would, on his day, bake elaborate plated loaves, distribute bread to the poor, walk in procession through the streets with blessed bread, hold baking competitions or fairs. In some areas these breads took the form of bishops' mitres braided, staffs crossed peels, baking tools. Other saints had their own breads. Saint Bridget, the 1st of February, oat or barley cakes in Celtic lands. Saint Nicholas, December 6th, sweet rolls. 4 kids in Germany. Saint Joseph, March 19th, bread altars in Italy, sometimes featuring symbolic loaves. Christmas and Yule bread was a staple in winter feasting, notably at Christmas and the winter solstice. Yule loaves. From pagan midwinter observances, Yule loaves were sumptuous and decorative, often included honey-dried fruit spices, when available molded into animals, pigs, deer, sun, symbols, and, in all likelihood, wheels. In some areas, a Yule loaf was set on table for 12 nights and eaten only on Epiphany. Christmas. Bread customs. Germany. Stollen, a loaf-shaped fruitcake, covered in sugar or icing, representing the newborn Christ in swaddling clothes. Italy. Panettone, a sweet, high bread loaf made with raisins and citrus. France. Pain de pieces, spiced honey bread, molded as angels or stars. At Christmas, bread was a symbol of hope, generosity and warmth, especially in darkest days of the year. Bread at weddings and births. Bread marked life's greatest milestones. Wedding breads in Eastern Europe. You will also find the korovai, a tall braided wedding bread, which was a necessity, with birds representing the pair embossed upon it, sprinkled with poppy or sesame for fertility, smashed and passed around to all guests, a testament to unity in France and England. Couples would break a loaf over the bride's head, a fertility blessing. In some parts of Scandinavia, several special loaves of rye were baked for the bride's family, sometimes tied with ribbons or herbs. Birth breads. On occasion, new mothers would be given sweetened or enriched bread if they could afford it. Churching bread was handed out when a mother returned to Mass after giving birth in impoverished villages. Neighbors baked loaves of bread, shaped like swaddled babies, as blessings of health for children. Bread in death and remembrance. Bread also symbolized death, from feeding mourners and honoring the dead to helping souls move through purgatory. Funeral loaves. At funerals, it was traditional to bake soul loaves or corpse cakes. These were beanies handed out as a going-away present on the breast of the dead, to soak up sins, sometimes interred with the body or placed at crossroads or gravesites. The soul mass cake was baked in medieval England for All Souls' Day, November 2nd. Children would go souling, knocking from door to door, seeking these loaves in return for prayers. This tradition eventually transformed into what we recognize today as Halloween, Carnival and Lent. The bread that we are absent from ever is disappearance. Desire bread also played a crucial role in mediating the medieval opposition between feast and fasting. Carnival. Before Lent, a 40-day fasting period, days were spent in gluttony. Bakers created sweet, fried breads, rich pastries and butter enriched. Loaves. The bread represented earthly pleasure, momentarily to be foregone. Lent. During Lent, certain breads were forbidden. In the monasteries of the rye or barley loaves, of a week old, could be consumed. Some monks subsisted on only bread and water as a spiritual discipline. The bread shortage, experienced during Lent, was a symbol of the suffering of Christ and purification. Blessings, charms, and superstitions. Not all bread rituals were sanctioned by the Church. Folk beliefs. A cross, which was cut in the dough before baking, served as a protection against evil. Bread dropping onto the floor was a sin or an omen. It must be kissed and blessed. Giving the first crust to cattle made them kindle with modoivru. Sarapa bread, baked during an eclipse or storm, was believed to become moldy or curse the house. In certain alpine villages, a bread doll symbolizing the grain deity was made at harvest time and buried in the fields. Bread was not merely food but a magical object, connecting people to the unseen powers of nature and spirit. Decorative and festival breads. Many celebration loaves were edible art, braided or twisted to represent eternity, cut in wheels, crosses, doves, dragons, or sheaves of wheat with tint of saffron, spiced or dyed with vegetable colors, ribbon, seeds and leaves to your heart's content. Bakers in the cities vied with one another in producing festival bread that should at once astonish the eyes and gladden the stomach. In other festivals, enormous loaves, which could weigh more than 20 kilos, were paraded round town and cut ceremonially. Bread and community identity. Each town had its own breads, associated with its patron saint or local lore. Examples: EINSIEDELN, Switzerland. Pilgrim breads imprinted with the Black Madonna. Gubbio, Italy. Hot loaves prepared on St. Ubaldo's Day, given to each family. York, England. Commemorative miracle loaves. In honor of a local martyr, these loaves were not just food, they were emblems of place and faith and identity. Baking them was to participate in a communal cultural memory. Conclusion of Chapter 11. Bread was not just food in the Middle Ages. It was the reflection of the human spirit. It was formed, consecrated, imparted, and honored during all seasons of life: harvest and hunger, birth and burial, fasting and feasting, marriage and mourning. Bread itself was neither symbolic nor utilitarian. It was to bake, was to enter into life's great cycles, to recognize the mystery of creation, the miraculous persistence of life, the power of a community. To summarize, bread celebrated every major medieval holiday, from Lammas to Lent. Every feast came with its own shapes, its own ingredients, and its own meanings. Bread was a gift, a symbol, and even sometimes a sacred object. Communities used bread to bless, recall, and unify. The story of bread is also the story of our humanity. In Chapter 12, we will take a walk into regional bread diversity. How did the bread of France differ from that of Byzantium in terms of appearance and taste? How did Jewish communities or Moorish Spain develop their own baking traditions? Let's take a look at how geography, religion, and culture gave rise to a remarkably diverse collection of medieval breads. If this chapter spoke to you, leave a comment with your favorite bread memory or festival where bread was involved. Bread, after all, is meant to be broken and shared. Common parlance has it that there was no such thing as a loaf of bread in the Middle Ages, by which we mean a white, round, crusty loaf, because such a loaf of bread seems to us synonymous with what we know to eat on a daily basis, seems the very definition of bread. But this is a simplification. In reality, the medieval world was a place of astonishing bread diversity, all of it connected to the soil, the people, and the spirit of a particular place. From the chewy baslama of Anatolia to the egg-rich brioche of early French courts, from the leavened dry loaves of the Baltic to the flatbreads of Al-Andalus, bread wasn't just a universal staple, it was a cultural fingerprint. So we begin a wandering betwixt familiar culinary landscapes and the medieval past and its vicinity, to tread the footsteps through time and place of how bread in its various forms rose from climate, economy, belief, and trade. Be prepared to find not just one, but hundreds of medieval breads that each have their own story. A grain melange, the basis for regional variety. Bread diversity starts with grain diversity. Grains, by contrast, could be grown in varying languages by different areas, depending on factors like climate, soil, and technology. Region common: grains used Northern Europe rye, barley, oat Southern Europe white, durum wheat, millet Eastern Europe rye, buckwheat Middle East and North African mar, durum, sorghum Byzantine, Empire wheat, barley. These grains shaped, textured, dense or fluffy on color. Dark rye versus pale wheat. Storage rye has more shelf life. Wheat goes stale more rapidly. Metaphorical and class association: wheat equals nobility and rye equals peasants. Climate was sovereign. Bread followed the rhythm of what could grow and keep. Western Europe, the kingdom of the loaf. France. Medieval France was a hotbed of baking ingenuity, particularly in its cities. Urban bakeries. By the 13th century there were professional guilds in both Paris and Lyon. urban residents commonly purchased daily bread from public ovens. Bread types: plain bis, brown, bread more or less brown of semi-refined wheat, sometimes mixed grains. Pain blanc fine bread, for the rich and the clergy. Pain de ménage, household bread, so called because it was homemade, usually in weekly batches at local bread ovens. Breads of the feast, sweetened, twisted, meaningful. It wasn't until the late medieval era in France when bakers started to play with fat-laden breads, the forerunners of brioche enriched with eggs, milk, and butter for feast days. England bread in England was a marker of social class and region. Common types: cocket, fine flour, white loaf, expensive weistel, a fine bread, usually white, and enjoyed by nobles. Tourte, bulky, low quality, loaves of rye or maslin rye, combined with wheat. Horse bread, a loaf, dark and hard, made of beans, peas. Bran sometimes eaten by the poorest. In rural, however, you depended on manorial ovens, while towns were served by regulated public bakeries. The size of bread went into weights and prices. In Chapter 10, Central and Eastern Europe, a rye revival, the Holy Roman Empire, today's Germany, Austria, Switzerland. Cold winters and tough soil favored rye, which in turn produced dense, dark breads. Common varieties: Schwarzbrot, black bread, the dense type of dark rye bread. Pumpernickel, early forms are coarse, slow-baked rye with molasses or sour beer. Brotleib, round, crusty country loaves baked every week. Bread was frequently soured in a natural process, leading to discoveries of sourdough early on. In the monasteries and in cities like Cologne or Nuremberg, baking was a fine art. Poland, Hungary, and the Slavonic lands in these parts, rye, buckwheat and millet were rotated according to soil and crops. Bread, or Schlab, Slavic word for bread, as it was called, was round with a sour flavor. Easter, weddings and funerals required special loaves. Stuffed breads came early with cheese, with herbs, with cabbage. Southern Europe, wheat, oil and festival loaves. Italy, it had a surplus of wheat in several places, leading to lighter, more delicate breads. Urban innovations. Previous sentences: Florence and Venice had gubernations de pastoribus that oversaw them. Bakers made ciabatta-like loaves, enriched with olive oil. Types of bread: Pain, Toscano, saltless. Bread used best as an accompaniment to salty cheeses and meats. Focaccia, Italian flatbread, topped with oil and herbs. Pain di festa, special holiday breads with figs, nuts, or raisins. Inside monasteries, bread was the baked cake for alms, which came in the form of crosses or doves. Spain and Al-Andalus. Medieval Spain was a cultural melting pot, and like in its kitchens, Christian, Jewish and Muslim bakers toiled alongside one another. In Christian Spain, pan candial, thick wheat bread, baked with wood and made from a well-kneaded dough. Pan de cruz, loaf with a cross, typical of Castile. In Al-Andalus Islamic Spain, flatbreads cooked on stones or tag inis, combining sesame, honey, saffron, and rosewater. In big cities like Cordoba and Granada, communal ovens baked day and night. Bread was thus a mirror of not just taste, but also faith, commerce, and cosmopolitanism. Constantinople, the bread of the imperial and the divine. The fusion of Roman traditions and Eastern mysticism occurred in the Byzantine Empire. Bread was baked in round clay ovens, as well as in city bakeries. Prospera, holy bread stamped with a seal, and ready to be blessed in liturgy. Breads commonly contained anise, fennel, and honey, indicating that influence from the east. C. Recessional, a receptacle for the bread on the communion table and in the Eucharist ceremony. The Islamic world, flatbreads and shared tables. The bread had put life on a firm footing across the Islamic world. Bread was also profoundly spiritual there. Types of bread: cobs, Moroccan round, unleavened bread, traditionally cooked in a communal bread oven, or tanouk, tanour bread, thin bread, made with presumably water and flour, and slapped on the walls of a tandoor. Throughout Iraqi. Bari, thick Iranian bread, usually served with cheese and herbs. Bread was leavened, though people baked it flat to bake it fast, and to share it easily. Cultural norms. Every bit of bread was sacred, and we never wasted a single crumb. The Prophet Muhammad reportedly never threw out a morsel of bread. The bakeries were frequently opened close to the mosques and schools, often offering a free bread to the poor. Jewish communities and the role of bread. Jewish bread was defined by religion, exile, and survival. Key types: challah, twist decor on top of Sabbath. Bread from late medieval Ashkenazi areas. Matzah, the knowist, bread eaten on Passover, represents the Exodus. Pitas commonly used in Sephardic communities, including in Al-Andalus and the Levant. Jewish bakers were often subject to legal restrictions, but in places such as Cordoba or Venice, they were celebrated for their excellent baking. Bread was closely linked to ritual purity, prayer and communal strength, trade, travel, and the transfer of baking ideas. And as roads opened and merchants roamed, traditions of baking traveled. Returning crusaders brought Eastern spices and the art of flatbreads. Arab traders brought sugar, sesame, almonds, and scent waters for baking to the Europeans. Bread rituals were carried by Jewish exiles from Germany to Spain to the Ottoman Empire. Each war, pilgrimage, or market opened its ovens up to new influences, gradually spreading bread across borders. Bread and cultural identity. Bread was not merely sustenance, it was identity. You could read the regional class and religious origin of someone based on their loaf. Bread was a map of culture, telling how people lived and what they valued and shared. Even in times of crisis, even in exile, people held fast to their bread traditions, a taste of home, a talisman of memory. Conclusion of Chapter 12. There were all kinds of breads in the Middle Ages: flat and puffed, sweet and sour, fine and coarse, round and braided, blessed and bountiful. It was as varied as the people who made it, but always familiar, the thing that came first to the table and stayed last in the memory. To summarize, bread diversity was influenced by local grains, climate, religion, and economy. Areas produced unique textures, tastes, sensations, and symbolism. Allah, Jesus Christ, Jehovah, and various gods of old, invariably raised the bread to the level of culture. Trade and migration resulted in an unceasing cross-fertilization of influence and adaptation. We started our journey in the dim pre-dawn of the Middle Ages, observing peasants crushing grain with handstones and millers harnessing rivers to flour machines. We journeyed through manorial ovens, monastic bakehouses, village fairs, and feast day rituals. We reached the sacred and the profane, the hunger and the surplus, the loaves of the king and the crusts of the beggar. And now, in this last chapter, there is time to stand back from the smoke and the kneading tables and ask, what did it all mean? And more importantly, what remains? This is bread as memory, metaphor, mirror. It's a tale of how a food so simple became a language, how a crust can still speak of centuries, and how medieval bread has survived in bakeries and beyond, because it lives on, I'd say, in beliefs, values, and instincts that we never surrendered. Even in the smartphone age, let us pass around a last loaf, warm, broken open, loaded with meaning. Bread as legacy, the threads that held cookie. But many medieval bread traditions endure after centuries of change. Techniques that survived. Sourdough fermentation has become a worldwide fad, but it has ancient and medieval roots. Wood ovens are back in the bakery studio just as they were found in every single village in the Middle Ages. Rye breads, barley loaves, and flatbreads persist in regional cuisines throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Many of the breads you encounter today in purist chic bakeries and home kitchens have structured symbolism and technique rooted in medieval custom. Examples: Colin Ente Cornwild is now gives German pumpernickel, gives early medieval rye loaves. Tuscan signed Pain Sioko equals bread of the Middle Ages plus saltless. Jewish challah gives a development from Shabbat loaves of early medieval era. Moroccan khobz gives no change in the shape and form of medieval Islamic home. Even the gesture of slashing dough before it goes into the oven, or making a cross with a knife, evokes medieval ritual. What bread meant to medieval people, and why it still matters. Bread in the Middle Ages was never merely sustenance. It was sign of the cross of justice. Chapter 10:1 Sacrament, Chapter 1 and Chapter 4. A ritual object. Chapter 11 It is a quantity of time. Chapters 6 and 7 An instrument of social discipline and resistance. Chapters 2 and 9 Eating bread was becoming an act of moral, spiritual, and political practice. And this still resonates, even today. Bread brings people together at tables, is made available in rituals and festivals, is often centered in crises and conflict, is considered a basic Human right bread serves a function as a symbol of justice and survival, and the echoes of medieval belief have not all faded. They're baked into our brains. The old breads that took over America in the 21st century, we have seen a revival of old practices. The world may even have gone on to industrialize and process many foods, while yet taking a turn for following the slow, ancient ways of baking. The artisan bread movement, back to the wild fermentation, that is, sourdough starters, offers a second chance for local, ancient grains. Einkorn, spelt, immer. Uses stone-ground flour, just as the querns of medieval Europe did, encourages community, baking through commercial oven cooperatives and farmers' markets. This is not tanking nostalgia, but a response to the dehumanization of food. In our quest to slow down and reconnect, we have unearthed medieval values. When you tear or bite into a crusty pan-shaped loaf, you're biting into the past. The lessons of the medieval loaf. So, here are some of the basic lessons that medieval bread can teach us in the modern world. Simplicity yields depth. Now, bread in medieval times was made from 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. Sometimes not even salt, but it provided infinite interpretations. Lesson: simplicity can be profound. The things that are essential usually have the most depth if we stop to notice it. Community is strength in medieval Europe. 1. What was bread? Baked communally, eaten together, shared with the poor, offered during ritual. It was never designed to be hoarded. Lesson: food is stronger when shared. Bread is a lesson in the fact that there is a bond between courage and generosity, between selflessness and the common good, between nourishing oneself and nourishing other people. It's an education in social survival. Ritual grounds us from feasting day loaves to fasting bread. Medieval people connected bread to life's rhythm. Lesson: we long for cycles, grounding, and ceremony. Baking bread, especially seasonally or ritually, provides a way to return to a sense of being in time, instead of just watching it pass. The ordinary can be sacred. Monks and kings ate the same crust of bread. At its humblest, it was nothing more than the body of Christ, the heart of sacrifices, the place where love went. Lesson: sanctity is not always magnificent. Often, it dwells in the everyday, the broken, and the small. Know your bread, know your world. A medieval human could infer things about you, where you lived, how much money you had, what you believed, based solely on the bread you ate. Lesson: we still tell our story through our food. To eat mindfully, to know the history of what we consume, is to become more human and more connected. What we've forgotten and could remember again. Modern bread is often mass-produced flavourignists, from origin robbed of ritual. We have freedom from inconvenience, but possibly at the cost of connection. We have to remember that to medieval people, the bread, while strong, rough and work requiring, brought time and attention, skill and respect. Communal meaning we don't have to return to feudalism, but we can reclaim slowness, intention, cultural memory. Letting dough rise without talking is so satisfying. The emergence of heritage and revival around the world. People are resuscitating medieval breads. Farmers seed heritage, wheat varieties, formerly cultivated in monasteries and fiefdom fields. They're recovering lost recipes from medieval manuscripts for bakers. Archaeologists are baking bread with a 4,000-year-old strain of yeast obtained from ancient Egyptian pottery. Churches resume loaf mass services. Museums instruct in historical baking with wood-fired ovens. This is not a gimmick. It is a hunger for continuity, for bread that has a story to tell. Bread is a global heritage, although this series was dominated by Europe and the Islamic world. Every culture on the planet has its bread, and many of them, in their attitude, skill and values, are the pick of medieval Europe. Injera in Ethiopia, lavash in Armenian, and in India, ripas in Colombia, tandoori, roti in Persia-Montu, in China, bannock in the Celtic north. Each one has a story of a seed's journey to flour, to fire, and to the table, and in many of these traditions, medieval practices survive. Bread is a World Heritage product. To learn it is equivalent to reaching out and touching the lives of billions of ancestors. Episode wrap: the shape of the story. Q. What inspired you to research how bread was made in the Middle Ages? We discovered how grains were milled, how doughs were kneaded, how loaves taken from the oven and shaped, the life of bakers, the regulation of ovens, the laws that protected every crumb, how bread defined every stage of life and ritual of the year. How bread tasted unlike anything else in any region, although it was always bread. But beneath process, we found philosophy, Bread is more than food. It is culture, morality, time, attention, struggle, hope and soul. The final word to the viewer, to everyone who has watched or listened through this series. You have tracked the loaf from millstone to monastery, from soil to soul. Let this journey reframe the way you think about bread. Next time you eat it, consider the hands that once threshed barley in a medieval field. Think of the woman carrying her dough to the Lord's oven. Imagine the monk kneeling while his loaf cooled on the windowsill. Think of the hungry serf who stowed crusts away in his coat. Imagine the small child breaking a festival loaf of bread in the form of a dove, and perhaps, just perhaps, bake a loaf yourself. Feel that ancient transformation. Flour, water, fire, life. Goodbye from the Middle Ages. Hope you enjoyed the ride through the universe of medieval breads. Did this series warm your heart? Tell us in the comments your thoughts and your warmest wishes, or your favorite bread memory. And remember, bread is meant to be broken and shared, as it was in the Middle Ages, as it is now. Until next time, may your fire be warm, your hands floured, and your table full.